They said that when the sun vanished behind the horizon and refused to return, the north belonged to the night. For months at a time, darkness stretched unbroken across frozen seas and silent forests, swallowing villages and hearts alike. In that endless winter, the Vikings listened to the wind as though it carried the voices of things not meant to be heard. The night was not merely absence of light, it was a living veil, breathing around them, waiting for fear to grow bold. Before we descend deeper into that ancient dark, take a moment to join Boring Bedtime Stories, so this tale and others may find you safely before your own night begins. And if you are listening, curled beneath a blanket or far from the northern frost, tell in the comments from where you watch these shadows unfold. Imagine the world before lamplight, when only fire stood between humanity and whatever prowled beyond its reach. The Vikings, seafarers of courage and conquest, were not immune to that primal trembling that comes when sight fades. To them, the night was a force of its own, a tide that could not be fought. A ship without the stars was lost, a house without its hearth was exposed. The long winters were battles not only against cold, but against the unseen hunger of darkness itself. They built their homes low and close, the roofs heavy with turf to block the wind's cry. Inside, the flames burned through driftwood and pine resin, casting orange ghosts on wooden walls. Stories kept the dark at bay better than any weapon. To name what they feared was to control it, if only for a heartbeat. In those whispered hours, they spoke of creatures that sought the warmth of men, shades that envied breath, spirits that walked when snow silenced their graves. One could almost hear them, the soft crunch of unseen feet upon frost, the sigh that came from no mouth known to the living. The Vikings did not separate the natural from the supernatural as we do now. The world of gods, beasts, and men was a single woven cloth, and when darkness descended, the threads between all three shivered. Night opened the seam where things from the other side might slip through. In the deep north, nights stretched into ages. Even the bravest warriors felt small beneath skies where no dawn came for weeks. The old sagas tell of men who wandered too far from the fire and never returned, their names lost to the fields of ice. Others returned with haunted eyes, muttering of lights dancing like souls, or of whispers that promised knowledge too costly for mortal minds. The northern night was both teacher and tormentor. By the glow of the hearth, mothers warned their children not to stare too long into the dark. They said the shadows stared back, patient and hungry. The forests were full of draugr, spirits of drowned sailors, and unburied warriors who refused rest. These beings were not distant ghosts, but familiar warnings. The sea that fed the Vikings could also swallow them, and so could the night. The Vikings lit torches of pitch and hung charms of bone and iron on their doorways. Some carved runes for protection, invoking Thor's hammer or Freya's blessing to keep away misfortune. Iron was the blood of the earth, strong against all that was ethereal. They trusted it more than virtue. And still, even behind sacred symbols, hearts trembled when the winds howled through the fjords, when ice cracked like distant laughter. The myths that grew from these fears were not simple tales. They carried warnings, teachings dressed in wonder. To survive the dark was to respect it, to understand that courage did not mean blindness to danger. The warrior who mocked the night was often the first to vanish. The wise one nodded to the black sky and poured a drop of mead for the unseen watcher. Fear to them was not weakness. It was wisdom born from the awareness that the world did not begin or end with men. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the rhythm of oars beating against the frozen surf, the muffled shouts of sailors steering through starlit void. Their ships glided silently, guided by the stars when clouds allowed, praying that the aurora borealis would not shy away. Those lights, they believed, were glimmers from the shields of the Valkyries, guardians who ferried the fallen to their fate. Yet even glory in death could not erase the dread of dying without honor, lost in the dark where no god might find you. The North was a place where myth and life walked side by side. Each storm carried a story, each silence an omen. To the Viking mind, the dark was the oldest of the gods, older than Odin, deeper than the sea serpent that circled the world. They called it Not, the night herself, a mother to fear and wonder both. Riding her steed, she swept across the heavens, cloaking the earth in her shadowed veil. From her womb came dreams, visions, and terrors that shaped the souls of men. Around the hearth, the skalds, the poets and keepers of memory, told how even Odin sought counsel in dreams that visited during Not's reign. She was not evil, but beyond good and evil, indifferent as the winter sky. Her silence demanded reverence. To insult her was to invite madness, to face the night unguarded and empty of prayer. And so the Vikings learned ritual, not merely for gods of war or harvest, but for the mistress of all shadows. There is something timeless in that reverence. Modern lights banish most darkness, yet even now, few remain untouched by a chill when alone beneath the stars. We have traded wooden halls for glass towers, but the night still speaks, soft and ancient. It hums through wires, lingers in the pauses of thought, reminding us that for most of human memory, survival meant listening. Those who dared mock the night learned its patience. Legends tell of chieftains who grew arrogant, who laughed at omens, who refused to offer sacrifice before sailing. Their ships were found adrift, the crew frozen in silence, the candles untouched. No storm, no wound, only the mark of something older than reason. Superstition to modern minds, perhaps, but to them it was proof that night never forgot insult. The first chapter of this tale stands as a threshold. Beyond it waits a world where myth breathes alongside history, where the night's creatures move unseen through time. There we will meet the Draugr, the wraith that walks between life and decay, and the wolves that chase the moon across eternity. But for now, picture the quiet snow falling upon a longhouse roof, the fire within flickering like a heartbeat. Outside, the North waits, dark and listening. Inside, the storyteller begins. To follow those tales safely through the seasons of shadow, remember the warmth of Boring Bedtime Stories, a hearth against the cold of sleep. The journey through Viking night is long, but every listener's voice lights the way. Tell where you are from, traveler, and let your words join the fire. For as long as stories are told, the night will never win entirely, and light, no matter how faint, will always find its way back. When the North tilted away from the sun, the world transformed into an endless dusk. Days blurred into twilight, and nights consumed what little remained of warmth and color. For the Vikings, this shift marked not a season, but an age, a slow surrender to the dominion of shadows. The rhythm of life bent beneath its weight, as though the land itself held its breath. Everything, the hunts, the voyages, the rituals, waited for dawns that did not come. To understand the Viking fear of night, one must first understand how completely light shaped survival. Crops withered, animals huddled close, and even firewood became treasure when the sun withdrew. Time felt distorted, stretched thin by darkness and silence. In this strange stillness, humans turned inward, forced to confront the unseen landscape of the soul. The line between fear and reverence blurred like fog upon the fjords. The Vikings saw their world as a living being, where every element possessed spirit and purpose. The night was no exception. It was not simply an absence, but a presence, old as the world itself. Its silence had a voice, and its cold breathed meaning. They called it the Age of Shadows because it was more than a time of year. It was a cycle through which every creature passed, a ritual of endurance that demanded humility before its greater will. Imagine the villages blanketed in snow, only the dim glow of embers marking the separation between safety and the unknown. Life gathered tightly around those fragile circles of heat, while the rest of the world drifted into obscurity. Outside, wolves prowled through frozen fields, their howls echoing as reminders that the wild still ruled beyond human reach. Those who wandered past the fire's edge risked vanishing into stories. The dark became both a boundary and a mirror. Night's power was not merely physical, but spiritual. It was believed that in the depth of winter, the borders between worlds grew thin. The spirits of the dead roamed freely. The gods listened closer. The living lit candles and whispered prayers, hoping to be acknowledged but not claimed. Even the bravest warriors placed charms at their bedsides, carved in runes of protection. They invited divine attention, but guarded against its full gaze, for too much of either light or darkness could burn. The sagas told of nights when the aurora danced fiercely across the heavens, an omen read differently by each heart. Some saw Valkyries crossing the sky, their armor catching the light of unseen fires. Others felt it was the breath of fallen heroes, flickering between realms. There was awe, yes, but also unease. Beauty was not always benign, and the Vikings knew that splendor could herald destruction just as easily as wonder. The Age of Shadows was thus both sacred and perilous. Daily existence became a dialogue with fear. The people did not flee from dread, they negotiated with it. They told tales to keep it from overwhelming them, passing oral memory from generation to generation. The stories were not distractions, they were survival. Children learned the shape of courage through the cadence of myth, reciting names of gods, beasts, and spirits before they could even hold a sword. In those tales, even fear had meaning, a companion as ancient as life itself. In longhouses, smoke clung to rafters thick with history. Families huddled close, sharing warmth and words as protection against the frozen expanse. The skalds spoke of times when light had abandoned the world entirely, and only those who kept faith survived. They sang of a coming twilight, not just of the year, but of all creation. Ragnarok, the end that would begin in deepest night. Through these prophecies, dread became part of destiny. To fear was to understand the fragility of order. The Vikings did not see their gods as distant saviors, but as participants in the same cosmic struggle. Even Odin, the Allfather, was not immune to the mysteries of night. He journeyed through shadows in search of wisdom, sacrificing sight for vision. His story reflected theirs. To uncover truth, one must face what cannot be seen. The Age of Shadows, then, was also an age of transformation. Darkness was not only enemy, it was teacher. When the winds tore through the mountains, shrieking like beasts, people believed they carried the wild hunt, phantoms of warriors and spirits crossing the mortal sky. To hear them was to be reminded of mortality, a chilling echo of battles long ended yet never forgotten. Some villagers left offerings at crossroads, pleading for mercy from forces that paid little heed to human pleas. It was humility born from awe, not submission. To live in the north was to coexist with the incomprehensible. Every shadow had a story, and every sound after sunset bore intention. The creak of a beam, the flutter of ravens, the hum of the sea ice, they all spoke in the language of omen. The Vikings listened. Silence itself became sacred, a gap through which understanding might arrive. In this quiet, fear took form but also dissolved. Shaped by attention, it transformed from terror to wisdom. To them, courage was not the absence of fear, but its mastery through ritual and respect. There were nights, too, of profound beauty. Nights when the moon rose large and pale, casting silver paths across frozen lakes. The villagers would gather just outside their homes, wrapped in furs, breathing steam into the air like brief ghosts. Under that light, the world seemed reborn, washed of peril and soothed into stillness. For a few moments, they could forget the lurking unknown and feel that they belonged to both earth and sky. Then, slowly, warmth faded and the cold reclaimed its throne. Not every fear was supernatural. Hunger waited in every darkened corner. Livestock perished, stores of grain dwindled, and illness crept unseen through families weakened by the cold. Yet even these trials found expression in myth. They said that when food ran low, spirits tested the worthy, rewarding endurance with the promise of spring. In this exchange between suffering and faith, the Vikings forged meaning from endurance. Survival became an offering. From this balance of reverence and defiance grew a culture that thrived at the edge of the world. The Viking was not born fearless, but learned to make peace with fear, to channel it into discipline, exploration, and craft. Each voyage into unknown waters mirrored the eternal contest between light and dark. Each victory, no matter how small, was a candle held against the storm. The Age of Shadows was a proving ground for spirit and strength alike. As the longest nights came to pass, the people began to measure time, not through sunlight, but through faith. They marked the solstice with fire, symbol of rebirth, and believed the gods would one day restore balance once the earth had paid its due. The flickering light upon their faces was fragile, yet it endured, testament to their will. For beneath all myth and ritual lay one truth, that humanity's oldest courage is not in conquest, but in endurance. To the Vikings, every dawn that returned was a victory. Every glow upon the horizon reminded them that nothing, not even the deepest winter, could claim sovereignty forever. This faith did not erase fear, it illuminated it. The Age of Shadows shaped a people who saw the world as a living cycle of death and return, silence and song, darkness and dawn. In learning to survive the night, they discovered how to live. And when spring finally came, they did not thank the sun alone. They thanked the shadow too for teaching them what light truly meant. The fire crackled softly, painting shifting patterns on the walls of the longhouse. Beyond its circle of warmth, the night waited, vast and intimate, filled with things half imagined and wholly believed. The Vikings called it the veil, the thin line separating the seen from the unseen. To cross it, even with a glance, was to risk awakening spirits that preferred the quiet. Yet the human heart has always been curious, and curiosity is a bright ember against darkness. In those frozen lands, sound carried far. The whisper of snow sliding from a roof, the groan of timber settling in the cold, the distant cry of wolves, all melded into a chorus that blurred the border between life and legend. When the wind spoke through cracks in the wood, families listened, certain it carried messages from old gods or restless kin. The dark was a language, and each sound was a word. Understanding it meant safety, misunderstanding it meant doom. After the day's labor, people gathered close to the flames, telling stories to guard the mind from what lurked outside. The skald would lift his voice, steady and strong, filling the hall with rhythm that blended fear and awe. Children clung to their mothers as the old tales unfolded, tales of spirits that sought warmth, of voices in the forests that called the living by name. It was not mere entertainment, it was endurance in narrative form. Words kept madness at bay as surely as walls kept out the storm. Every whisper mattered. Some were harmless, the sigh of wind against frost, but others demanded attention. Hunters spoke of hearing their names on the breeze as they crossed snow-covered valleys, though no one could be seen. Sailors returned from voyages swearing they heard footsteps pacing the decks at night, long after the watch had turned. The Vikings did not doubt them. To dismiss such accounts was to invite the wrath of powers that lingered just beyond the firelight. The night, they believed, had memories of its own. It remembered promises broken, wars fought beneath its cloak, and blood spilled upon frozen soil. Those memories took shape as whispers, neither alive nor dead, echoing through the ages. The ghosts of ancestors mingled with the remnants of forgotten gods, both struggling to be remembered. The living were but guests in a home too vast to understand, surrounded by spectators unseen but ever present. Many longhouses kept a spirit place, a small corner left untouched, a seat no one used, a symbol of respect. Food and drink rested there during feasts, offerings for those who could not be seen. In the belief of the North, hospitality extended across all realms. To neglect the unseen guests was to risk misfortune. Sometimes when the wind turned strange, villagers swore they heard faint laughter from those empty spaces, as if the dead were pleased by the living's courtesy. yet not all whispers were friendly. Some came from the Draugr, the restless dead who envied the warmth of human breath. These beings haunted burial mounds and ship graves, drawn by the scent of fire and life. They were said to shuffle close at night, their eyes burning like sea embers, watching but unseen. Warriors who mocked them often vanished without trace, leaving behind disturbed snow and silence heavy with warning. The Vikings feared them more than beasts, for the Draugr were once like them, flesh turned by grief into darkness. Even gods could whisper in those hours. Odin himself was believed to travel about disguised as wanderer, his voice heard in gusts that carried riddles and prophecy. Some listened closely, hoping to glean wisdom. Others turned away, fearing the burden of knowing too much. Knowledge was light, but too much could blind, and in the north, such blindness was fatal. The whispers taught balance, to listen with reverence, but not seek beyond what the soul could endure. Sometimes, when storm and smoke met, strange phantoms danced upon the snowfields. The Vikings said those were memories of the earth, souls caught between world and sky. They could not rest because no one remembered their true names. Memory was more than sentiment. It was survival. To be forgotten was the worst fate. To be whispered was to remain alive in spirit. That is why every storyteller in the north carried the weight of both the living and the dead upon his tongue. The women of the villages held their own rituals to guard the threshold of night. They placed herbs upon coals, creating fragrant smoke that pleased the friendly spirits and repelled those that envied flesh. Some whispered charms into the smoke, each word a prayer, each exhale a line cast into the unseen. The house would fill with a sweet aroma of safety, though the air outside pressed cold and watchful. Through ritual, they reminded the dark that the living had their own kind of power. Children listened wide-eyed to the stories told in low tones. They learned not to call into darkness, never to answer voices whispering from unknown mouths. Such lessons were folded into myth because fear taught best when wrapped in wonder. They memorized the sound of true silence, the one unbroken by mischief or malice. It was said that if no sound echoed from the woods for too long, the night was listening, waiting for a misstep. In the north, wisdom slept in awareness. Between those whispers and silences lay the pulse of Viking life. They sang songs of protection when the sea froze, chanted to their gods while mending nets, and blessed their weapons before journeys. Speech itself became shield and invocation. Every word carried the spirit of the one who uttered it, and so every tale was a ceremony. Through that faith, they tamed fear, shaping it into meaning rather than letting it consume them whole. Once each year, during the darkest nights, villages held a vigil known as the Night of Listening. All fires were dimmed except one central flame. Around it, the people sat in silence, opening their minds to the stories whispered by wind, ice, and memory. Some claimed to hear the voices of ancestors recounting old victories or offering guidance. Others heard nothing and counted themselves lucky. By dawn, the silence broke with song, a quiet thanksgiving for surviving another night unclaimed. These customs shaped more than superstition. They created a rhythm to life that echoed through generations. The fear of darkness was transformed into a ritual of connection. The whisper beyond the firelight became a reminder that survival was never solitary. Those who listened deeply understood that they were part of something vast and ancient, bound to the land and its memories. The night did not exist to destroy them. It existed to remind them of their place within all things. In that stillness, courage took its truest form, not loud, not defiant, but calm. The Vikings lived with the awareness that the unseen world was not hostile by, it simply demanded respect. They learned to whisper back to it, acknowledging its presence and finding peace in coexistence. The symphony of crackling fire, soft breath, and murmuring shadow became their nightly prayer, a song for the balance between fear and faith. Even today, if you stand beneath a northern sky, away from all lights and sound, you might feel it. the quiet hum of ancient memory moving through air and snow. Some will say it's only the wind. But in the old tongue of the North, the word for breath and spirit was the same. Every gust carries a trace of the voices that once sang to endure the eternal night. And if you listen with patience, beyond the firelight, beyond the heartbeat of your own chest, you may hear them still. The whispers that kept a people alive when the world belonged to darkness. Among the tales born from the northern dark, none chilled the heart more deeply than that of the Draugr. These creatures were not ghosts nor demons, but the risen dead, bodies that refused the silence of the grave. The Draugr lingered out of greed, vengeance, or envy, their hunger bound not to flesh, but to memory. In life, they had been warriors, merchants, or kings, yet death revealed what their souls could not relinquish. They rose swollen and pale beneath moonlight, guardians of treasures that no living hand dared claim. The Vikings believed death was a voyage. The soul, if honored, traveled to Valhalla or the meadows of Freyja. But those consumed by obsession could not find the path. Something weighed them down, anchoring spirit to corpse until both rotted together in bitterness. The Draugr was the embodiment of unfinished life, a warning to those who prized possession over peace. Even the bravest warriors trembled at the thought of meeting one, for courage meant little when facing what should have stayed dead. When a man of great greed or wrath died, whispers spread through his village like winter through fields. People spoke cautiously, ensuring the body's burial was done with care and courage. The dead were placed with gifts meant to appease their pride, jewels, swords, and food for the afterlife. Yet even generosity was no guarantee. If slighted by insult or neglected ritual, the corpse might stir within its mound, its eyes burning with the dull glow of sea-worn stone. Once it rose, there was no reasoning with it. The Draugr was said to dwell within its burial mound by day, but as darkness fell, it wandered the fields and shorelines. It could grow in size at will, stretching taller than trees, or shrinking small enough to seep through cracks. Its strength was beyond measure, its stench unbearable, reeking of decay and seaweed. Wherever it went, frost followed, and even the animals fled from its presence. Some fishermen told of shadows rising from the mist, heavy as the sea's own sorrow, watching from the waves without breath. Legends warned that the Draugr craved more than gold or vengeance. It hungered for life's warmth, the pulse and voice of the living. It crushed bones not for nourishment, but to silence reminders of what it had lost. Its touch brought madness. Its gaze carried the chill of absolute death. Villagers believed that if you walked alone at night and felt your breath thicken, the Draugr was near, measuring your soul for envy. No prayer could stop it, only cunning might. Folk tales told of heroes who fought Draugr and lived to tell the tale. They carried weapons blessed in ritual, iron, the blood of the earth, forged by hands that feared not death. Others used wit, tricking the dead back into their mounds with riddles or false treasures. But victory against such beings was never complete. To confront the Draugr meant to stand before the mirror of greed itself. Even the victor left scarred, reminded that darkness does not die. It only sleeps between generations. The most feared Draugr dwelled in royal graves, guarding hoards meant for kings in eternity. Sailors passing by burial hills swore they saw blue fire flickering upon the stones, marking those cursed places. On certain nights, when mist rolled from the fjords, villagers would hear the sound of iron scraping rock, the restless movements of those who had not yet accepted their fate. To disturb a mound was to awaken its master, and once a Draugr's hunger was stirred, no wall could keep it from the living. To prevent such horror, the Vikings devised elaborate rituals. When a warrior died, his eyes were sealed with coins to blind him to envy. His nails were trimmed so they could not grow into claws. Some even drove iron spikes through the corpse to pin it to the earth, whispering sacred runes to chain its spirit. A ship burial, where fire consumed both body and treasure, was considered safest of all. the sea's embrace left nothing for the Draugr to return to. Fire purified what ice could not. But not all could afford fire or sea. Many were buried close to home, where the cold soil clung to their grudges. Families kept watch for signs: the creak of a door, though no wind blew, the sudden dimming of a flame, the sleeping child who murmured names of the dead. If the marks appeared, elders acted swiftly. They gathered herbs and charms, spoke prayers in secret tones, and sometimes dug up the grave to move the body far from human dwellings. Death, it seemed, required maintenance. There was one tale, whispered by skalds on nights of storm, of a chieftain named Arvald. He had built his fortune through conquest and cruelty, hoarding the spoils of a dozen raids. When death finally came, no one mourned him, yet his burial mound glistened with stolen gold. Weeks later, shepherds vanished near the hill, and by moonlight villagers saw movement where only stones should be still. Arvald's Draugr rose to gather what he had claimed in life, his laughter a hollow echo rolling through frost. It took 3 winters before his curse was undone, when a wandering seer lured him back into his mound with a mirror polished from ice, showing him his own deformity. He vanished at dawn, and the land sighed in relief. Such stories carried warning as much as terror. They reminded the living that wealth and rage chained the soul as surely as ropes bound the flesh. The Draugr was not only a monster, it was a reflection of imbalance. To hoard, to harm, to refuse forgiveness, these were seeds that grew into restless hunger. The dead revealed what the living preferred to forget, that the weight we cling to becomes the weight we carry into eternity. In quiet moments, when the northern wind shrieked against the eaves, one could almost believe that the Draugr still watched from its mounds. Perhaps not in form, but in echo. The human heart, after all, still trembles at the thought of losing everything it owns. The fear of the Draugr may have faded into myth, yet the truth beneath remains, a warning whispered through centuries, that greed is a chain too heavy for even death to break. Yet there was another lesson in these tales, one less spoken. They taught gratitude, the art of release, the wisdom of letting go before the final breath. The Vikings did not tell these stories to frighten children, but to remind them that peace was an achievement. In honoring the dead properly, they honored the balance between world and afterlife. Fire, wind, and earth each played their part in ensuring that spirits found their rightful road. As the storyteller's voice waned and the fire dimmed, the faces around the hearth leaned closer, drawn by the gravity of fear. Outside, the dark pressed against the walls, listening, perhaps remembering. The tale of the Draugr was not only about the undead, it was about all that refused to rest, the memories, the regrets, the hunger for more than what existence allows. The skald would end the story softly, as if to lull the night itself back to calm. And when silence finally claimed the room, every listener understood that some shadows were best left sleeping beneath the earth. The night deepened, embracing the village in mute respect. Above, the stars shone like watchful eyes, cold and unwavering. The fire sank to embers, each spark a reminder of life's fragile defiance against oblivion. Somewhere beyond the hills, snow fell over the graves, sealing them once more in white peace. For now, the dead would sleep. But as long as men hoarded greed and grudges, the Draugr would never vanish completely, waiting, patient and hungry, in the soil of every human heart. The night sky over the north was more than canvas. It was battlefield and prophecy. Beneath its pale glow, the Vikings saw not a passive moon, but a prey eternally hunted. High above, 2 wolves, Skull and Hati, ran their endless chase, one pursuing the sun, the other the moon. Their hunt was no fable to the Norse imagination. It was the living pulse of their world, explaining why light fled and darkness triumphed each dusk. In this story, cosmic order itself trembled each time the wolves drew close enough to bite. Children were raised on the tale, taught that when the wolves howled loudest, it meant they were nearing victory. The eclipse, when shadow devoured the moon, became a moment of near apocalypse. Villagers would gather outside, armed with iron and fire, banging shields to drive the beasts away. They believed their noise lent strength to celestial defenders, staving off Ragnarok for another day. Though they could not touch the sky, their voices joined the great cosmic struggle, each heartbeat a plea for the return of light. In these moments, fear became unity. The Norse did not separate from myth. Both breathed together beneath the same cold heavens. To watch the moon vanish was to see the fabric of existence tested. It reminded them that even gods were vulnerable, and that fate itself, the inexorable weaver, had predators. The wolves embodied the darkness that chased every life, an eternal hunger that no victory could sate, only delay. By firelight, skalds told how the twin hunters were born from Fenrir, the monstrous wolf destined to bring ruin. Hjörl, the light eater, chased the sun, while Hati sought the moon. Each night they ran across the sky, their jaws glinting like frozen iron. When the northern winds sang, it was said to be their breath, and when snow fell in silence, it meant they were near, padding unseen through the crisp air. To hear a wolf crying in midwinter stirred more than fear. It awakened memory, a reminder of what stalked even the gods. Yet this myth was not despairing. Beneath its dread beat a deeper truth. Existence itself endured through cycles of pursuit and renewal. When the moon escaped the wolf's fangs, light was reborn. The chase would never end, and in that endlessness, the Vikings found comfort. The universe persisted not by safety, but by struggle. They too fought in that rhythm, sailing against storms, battling hunger, surviving endless winters. The wolves reminded them that life's beauty was made sharper by its peril. Some said that wolves on Earth were sacred echoes of their celestial kin. To the Vikings, these creatures embodied both loyalty and ferocity. A wolf could guard or destroy, depending on how it was treated. Warriors adorned helmets with wolf motifs, invoking courage that bordered on savagery. To fight like a wolf was to fight with heart unflinching before terror. Berserkers, those who entered battle in trance-like fury, were believed to take on the wolf's soul, discarding fear and hesitation like old skins. In the woods outside villages, real wolves hunted silently, unseen but ever present. Their amber eyes reflected fire from afar, twin lights that watched but did not interfere. The boundary between the earthly and divine blurred in those glances. Many believed that wild wolves carried messages from gods or forefathers. When one howled at dusk, it was not dreaded, but heard as part of the greater choir of existence, a voice singing from the edge of night, reminding men of their smallness. Still, there were darker interpretations. Not every howl was seen as omen of balance. Some were warnings. The sagas tell of winters when wolves multiplied beyond number, preying upon livestock and lone travelers. During those seasons, the people felt the prophecy breathing closer. They whispered that Skjöl and Hati's hunger had spilled into the mortal world, that the threads of the sun and moon were fraying. Each slain wolf was buried with care, lest its spirit rejoin its masters above and hasten the end. The symbolism stretched further. Wolves were also time, unyielding and circular. Their chase mirrored human fate, the inescapable march toward decline. Yet within that doom lay resilience. The Vikings saw themselves as moon and wolf both, pursued and pursuing, fleeing death even while embodying it. Acceptance of transience became power. By living as fiercest hunters and humblest prey, they embraced the full breadth of what it meant to be alive. During long voyages, sailors gazed upward, using the moon as their compass. They imagined Hati licking its edges, daring to taste silver light. Through storms, the moon's disappearance struck terror deeper than thunder. Without it, the world became blind. Tradition held that a quick prayer spoken to Mani, the moon god, could renew its strength and keep Hati at bay. And so, even at sea, man's faith intertwined with the chase, as fragile voices met the vast cruelty of night. A tale often recited by elders spoke of a shepherd who pitied the wolves during a famine. He offered them the carcasses of his flock so they would spare the living. In return, they howled each night before the moon rose, warning him of coming snow. The villagers mocked him until the beasts vanished, and with them, his luck. The story's moral lingered. Mercy toward darkness could buy protection, but to take it for granted courted ruin. The balance between reverence and arrogance hung thinner than a hair's breadth. Each generation reinterpreted the myth in reflection of its time. Some saw the wolves as cruelty incarnate, while others believed they were guardians, ensuring that the world did not stagnate in complacency. After all, if day never ended, there would be no yearning, no growth. The wolves, in their hunger, gave meaning to endurance. Even destruction was sacred, for it cleared the way for renewal. Fire devours, but also warms. Night consumes, but also resets the stars. The hunt above echoed the truths below. When the first winter full moon arrived, a ritual took place. The villagers gathered beyond the settlement, surrounding a great bonfire shaped like a wheel, the sun reborn. Elders recounted the story of Skjöld and Hati, their voices merging with the crackle of flames. Children were told to howl at the sky, mimicking the divine chase, ensuring light's survival. For a brief hour, fear became play, myth became song, and the boundary between human and divine grew beautifully thin. Even priests and seeresses interpreted dreams of wolves with dual meaning. To dream of being chased by one meant the gods were testing resolve. To run alongside them foretold courage and transformation. In their sleep, people confronted their own predators, guilt, grief, desire, ambition, and woke renewed, having survived another small Ragnarok within their hearts. The celestial wolves, distant as they were, lived also inside every person, driving them onward through the cycles of life and death. As years passed, the myth blended with weather and superstition. The howls became omens for harvests and births, storms and wars. When Christian travelers arrived in the north centuries later, they were unnerved by how calmly these people spoke of being hunted by gods. But to the descendants of ice and fire, the chase was not curse. It was reminder that all things are finite, and only the courage to run gives them meaning. To flee the wolves was to accept the cosmic dance. On nights of silence, when moonlight stretched across the fjords like pale silk, one could imagine the ancient chase continuing overhead. The wolves still ran, their paws striking constellations, their breath thickening the clouds. Somewhere, the gods watched, neither victorious nor defeated. Down below, fires flickered in lonely halls, and human voices whispered ancient songs to steady their hearts. The chase would restart tomorrow, as it had since time's first breath. To the Vikings, this endless pursuit explained not only the heavens, but their own hearts. Each triumph carried the shadow of failure, each joy the echo of fear. Yet through it all, they believed in renewal, the return of light after darkness, dawn after dread. And as long as the fires of their hearths reflected the glow of the eternal moon above, they knew that no wolf, no night, could swallow them forever. There were places in the north where even the bravest refused to walk after sunset. Narrow inlets where the sea whispered secrets, forests that breathed like living beasts, and valleys where echoes spoke long after the living had gone. These were the fjords, tombs carved by time itself. The Vikings believed that among their silent cliffs dwelled ancient spirits, remnants of the world's first ages. Forgotten by gods and men alike, they lingered between mist and memory, guardians of what mortals were never meant to see. Each fjord possessed a different voice. Some sighed with sorrow, like old kings mourning their lost empires. Others growled with hunger, waiting for travelers careless enough to mistake beauty for safety. Beneath their surfaces, the cold waters hid stories older than language. The fishermen, who knew their moods best, never cast nets after dusk. They said the sea took back what was stolen when the sun fell, that the deep hungered for living names to echo in its halls. What little light remained clung desperately to rock and wave before surrendering to blackness. In these waters, spirits were said to dwell, neither friend nor foe, but reflections of the world's balance. They were called the Vetir, the unseen keepers of land and sea. Some guarded rivers, others mountains or forests, ensuring equilibrium remained unbroken. The Vikings respected them profoundly. Before building a home, they offered mead to the ground. Before setting sail, they poured ale into the tide. To offend a Vetir was to invite ruin, for they could twist weather and fate with a whisper. Legends spoke of nights when the mist moved with purpose, coiling like smoke around unaware wanderers. Those who followed its lure were rarely seen again. Some claimed the spirits dragged them beneath the fjord, trading their breath for silence. Others said the lost ones became part of the place itself, echoes bound to perpetuate the ancient murmuring. The air near such waters felt charged, thick with something neither wind nor cold. Animals refused to approach, and even the bravest warriors left small offerings instead of footsteps. Not all Vetir were benign. There were tales of Huldufolk, the hidden folk who lived behind veils of illusion. Beautiful and dangerous, they walked unseen beside humans, their laughter soft as falling snow. Fishermen claimed to glimpse them dancing on moonlit stones when fog was thickest. Those who stared too long risked being drawn into their world, a place where time moved differently, where a single night could become a lifetime. Others believed the Huldufolk envied mankind's mortality, longing for its brief, burning spark. Further inland, where rivers met ice, stories told of water takers, spirits who demanded tribute for passage. If ignored, they unleashed storms or froze travelers' breath mid-prayer. For centuries, sailors poured drops of mead overboard before a voyage, whispering thanks to the unseen for their mercy. They did not believe in conquering, but in coexisting with it. The northern worldview was not domination, it was negotiation. To survive the fjords was to honor what lived beneath them. Some fjords bore names of warning. There was the Silent Mouth, said to sing on nights when no wind blew, and the Bone Depth, where fishermen's nets returned tangled with broken ribs of unknown creatures. These stories were not exaggerations but boundaries, passed down through generations to teach reverence. To the Vikings, fear itself was a form of respect, a recognition of forces greater and older than ambition. The fjords were sacred not because of beauty alone, but because they revealed humility's necessity. One tale, told by sailors around distant fires, spoke of a young explorer named Idun, who refused to heed the old warnings. She sought what others feared, dreaming of mapping every shadowed inlet. One night, during a strange calm, she anchored her ship near the mouth of the Frostfjord. The air was still, and the moon shimmered upon waters so smooth they reflected the stars perfectly. Her crew begged her to stay, but curiosity outweighed caution. She descended alone into a small rowboat, carrying only a lantern. What happened next was whispered for generations. Hours passed, and her men heard singing, a voice not her own, rising and falling in rhythms older than tides. When dawn came, the boat drifted back upriver, empty except for the lantern, still burning. In its flame, they claimed to see a reflection not of the fjord, but of Idun herself, doubled and translucent, staring back with calm understanding. Some said the Vetir had claimed her as their messenger, others that she had simply chosen to stay in the only place where mystery outweighed fear. Her story was retold to caution explorers, but also to remind dreamers that awe and danger are siblings. The spirits of the fjords were rarely seen, but often felt. Villagers told of soft knocks on doors during long winters, as if the Dead Sea itself came pleading for remembrance. Dogs bristled at unseen footsteps. Flames flickered blue when unseen visitors brushed past. These moments were not treated as menace, but as reminders of coexistence. The Vikings lived in partnership with the unseen, respecting their boundaries as they did those of the sea. To forget them was to forget balance. In times of misfortune, failed crops, drowned sailors, blighted births, people sought to make amends with these forgotten beings. They left bread upon stones, milk by the shore, or songs at twilight. Skalds wrote verses of reconciliation, offered not to gods, but to the spirits themselves, as if words could heal fractures where offerings failed. Often peace followed, though whether by chance or mercy remained unknown. What mattered was faith in the dialogue, that even unseen forces heard and answered. From these customs grew traditions that shaped Viking identity. When settlers traveled beyond their homelands, they brought the spirits with them, not in body, but in reverence. New lands demanded new offerings, as every mountain and river possessed its own wardens. The unseen world expanded with every voyage. To honor it was to belong anywhere. To forget it was to risk being lost, not to the sea, but to meaning itself. The fjords, then, were not cursed, but alive. Their stillness contained countless voices, songs of beginnings the human tongue could never repeat. The Vikings felt this truth instinctively. They feared the dark, yet stepped into it. They revered the unseen, yet depended upon it. Every voyage, every battle, every hearthfire carried the echo of that awareness. To live without acknowledgement of spirits was to drift untethered through an indifferent world. Respect anchored existence. Sometimes, on quiet nights, the fjords still breathe as they once did. The wind slides gently through the cliffs, sounding almost human. The waves murmur messages the ear cannot translate, but the soul somehow understands. Those who stand still long enough feel it. The ancient pulse of forgotten spirits still awake, still watching, still guarding the living who remember their names through story. For in telling their tales, humanity ensures they are never entirely lost to silence. In a world where night reigned longer than day, words held more than meaning. They held power. To the Vikings, runes were not symbols of mere communication, but sparks of creation, fragments of the divine language spoken by gods when the world was first carved from chaos. Each mark was alive, humming with its own will, bound by no mortality. When ink or blade formed a rune, something invisible answered, listening and remembering. Through these ancient signs, humanity could speak directly to the forces that shaped light and shadow. In the dark stretches of winter, when voices of the unseen drew near, the people turned to runes for safeguard. They carved them into doorframes, etched them upon weapons, painted them across the decking of ships. Some whispered them as prayers, while others sang them into fires, watching the smoke coil upward like a promise carried to unseen ears. The act itself was a dialogue, a vow that human courage could be etched into the very fabric of night. The origin of runes, as told by the Skalds, was rooted in sacrifice. Odin, lord of wisdom and war, had hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights, wounded by his own spear, to glimpse the secrets hidden beneath existence. From death's threshold, he saw the runes shimmer in the void and seized them, gifting their power to mankind. Thus, every rune was born from pain and revelation, carrying within it the memory of divine endurance. To carve one was not simply to write, it was to participate in that primal act of insight and cost. The runes formed an alphabet, yes, but more, a code through which magic spoke. To carve Fehu was to invoke prosperity and movement. To inscribe Algiz was to call for protection. Isa brought stillness, and Tiwaz summoned strength of will. Each character belonged to both language and spirit. The Vikings believed that misusing runes, carving them wrongly, or speaking their names without understanding, invited imbalance. Just as they could shield, they could curse, and in careless hands, they brought calamity as surely as a dull blade in battle. In the longhouses where families huddled through sleepless nights, Elders taught children how to trace simple signs in ash and snow. The gestures kept dreams pure, they said, guarding the mind from the whispers of Draugr and other night-born souls. Warriors carved runes upon their shields before battle, not as boast, but as prayer. Farmers placed them on their plows to bless the earth and shield crops from frost. Hunters scratched them upon arrow shafts so that their flight would stay true. Life in the north was inseparable from these marks. They were the heartbeat of faith, daily as breath. There were rune masters, keepers of sacred knowledge, who served as both scribes and seers. Unlike warriors or priests, their authority came from silence and precision. They spent years studying not only the forms of runes, but their rhythm, the way sound and silence intertwined when one was spoken. Often they lived at the edge of villages, halfway between reality and the unknown, called upon in times of need when words alone no longer sufficed. People approached them with offerings, meat, mead, or memory, and asked for charms carved under the right moon. One story told of a rune master named Leifr, who faced a winter so long it seemed the world itself had forgotten dawn. A sickness spread through his village, striking both beast and man. No offering to the gods could lift it. So Leifr journeyed alone to a frozen lake, where he carved runes into the ice, one for each soul lost. As he bled from his carving hand, the symbols began to glow faintly, and beneath the ice he saw his reflection changed. It was not his face, but Odin's watching through. When he returned, the sickness had broken. The ice thawed days later, and the runes vanished, leaving only water as witness. Such tales shaped faith not as blind worship, but as living language. To use runes was to trust that intention mattered, that the universe listened to sincerity more than volume. The Vikings did not see their magic as defiance against gods, but as conversation with them. Each carved line was humble acknowledgement of both power and peril. Those who lived by the runes learned to study the pauses between steps, the silence between storms. To survive meant to notice, the way meaning often hides in the smallest gesture, the faintest sound. Runes also carried prophecy. When cast upon the ground, they revealed the weaving of fate, though never its full design. The Norns, the three sisters who spun destiny, were said to govern their language, whispering hints to those brave or foolish enough to listen. Seekers would scatter runestones across firs, reading patterns in how they landed, interpreting the play of chance as divine speech. What they sought was not control, but communion, to glimpse for a heartbeat how their thread shimmered among countless others. Yet there was danger in knowing too much. Some stories warned of men who grew arrogant, believing they could command the runes rather than honor them. One such tale spoke of Asgrim the Proud, who carved runes of binding upon the sea, demanding it to still so his ships might pass. For one night the waters obeyed, calm as glass. But when dawn rose, the sea reclaimed its voice, roaring with a vengeance. His fleet was lost, swallowed whole, and the runes sank with him, their glow fading into silt. The sea had reminded him that power borrowed through reverence cannot survive arrogance. The crafting of runes required more than hand and knife. It demanded intent, wood taken from sacred trees, bone cleaned of mortal warmth, and stones gathered under silence. They were vessels for breath. The act of carving transformed the ordinary into bridgework between realms. Once inscribed, each rune was awakened through whispering, a single breath imbued with purpose. Even the blade remembered what it cut, echoing faintly with the rhythm of meaning. For the Vikings, creation and devotion were inseparable. The sound of runes being carved was its own kind of song. The subtle scrape of metal against wood blended with the wind, forming the cadence of prayer. Many said that if you listened closely, you could hear responses carried in the air, a rustle of branches, a shift in the flame, a pause in the wolf's howl. The world listened back. That reciprocity defined the Viking soul. Belief as dialogue, not domination. They existed within the fabric of their myths, never above it. Runes guarded the home as steadfastly as swords guarded the body. Symbols for good fortune were carved into lintels, protecting families against spirits of disease and sorrow. When a child was born, elders traced runes upon water and sprinkled it upon the newborn's forehead, blessing breath and voice. The markings faded quickly, but the protection lingered, faith bound not to permanence, but to repetition. Reinscribing hope became the truest ritual of survival. In the darkest season, when blizzards howled and stars vanished for weeks, people gathered to renew their charms. Around shared flames, they redrew runes across doors and torches, reaffirming the contract with unseen guardians. Children watched wide-eyed as their elders murmured syllables, both strange and comforting. Each mark glowed faintly by lamplight, symbols of resilience flickering against the void. Though storms battered roofs and frost crept indoors, those signs reminded them that meaning endured, even when warmth faltered. Perhaps that is why runes endured long after other beliefs faded. They spoke of balance between human and divine, speech and silence, night and dawn. Their shapes still whisper through history, carved in stone yet alive in spirit. The Vikings carved their prayers not to escape fear, but to name it, to etch humanity's defiance into the walls of existence. And though the world has changed, the message remains. Every line of meaning, every spoken truth is a rune against the dark. Among the many figures that walked through Viking lore, none inspired as much awe and fear as the Volva, the seeress. She was neither queen nor priestess, though she could command respect from both. The Volva lived apart from others, dwelling at the mist-edged boundary between the mortal and the divine. Her life unfolded in solitude, yet her presence was sought by chiefs and warriors alike, for she held what few dared to pursue, the ability to pierce the veil of what was, what is, and what will be. To meet her eyes was to confront destiny itself. The seeress was said to be born different. Some spoke of children whose first cry came as a chant, or whose shadows lingered even when they moved. These signs marked them for the path that led toward the unseen. As they grew, elders taught them runes, herbs, and the sacred rhythms of the earth. Their training was not gentle. It demanded silence, fasting, and dreams that blurred into waking. To see beyond sight meant paying a price, losing a part of one's life to what lay in between. During the endless winters, when darkness pressed heavily upon villages, the Volva's voice became a lifeline. Wrapped in furs and carrying her carved staff, she entered longhouses heavy with worry. The scent of burning sage filled the air, mingling with fear and reverence. Warriors lowered their gaze, children hid behind their mothers, and the seeress began to speak. Her words fell slowly, each syllable deliberate, as though shaped by winds that did not belong to this world. Her staff was the source of her authority, carved with runes that glowed faintly under firelight. It symbolized Yggdrasil, the world tree that connected heaven, earth, and the underworld. Through it, the Volva channeled visions, drawing from the currents that bound all realms. When she struck it against the floor, silence answered. The creak of timber, the hiss of flame, even the wind outside seemed to pause, waiting for what would come next. The boundaries between story and truth, dream and reality, dissolved beneath her voice. Sometimes she closed her eyes and hummed low, weaving the threads of fate with her song. This chant, called Seder, was forbidden to all but those touched by the divine. It called upon forces older than the gods themselves, stirring the ancient roots of time. In her trance, the seeress left her body, her spirit wandering through the 9 worlds. There she saw visions not linear but circular, images of harvest and hunger, of birth and ruin intertwined. Upon waking, she spoke softly, warning or blessing those who were brave enough to ask the questions that haunted them. It was said that Odin himself had learned Seder from a Volva, humbling his pride to gain its wisdom. He, the Allfather of battle and storm, sought her because destiny spared none, not even gods. Through her counsel, he accepted that Ragnarok, the world's end, was inevitable, though he would fight it to the last breath. The story reminded every listener that knowledge was both weapon and wound. To see fate clearly was to carry the weight of futility and faith in equal measure. The Völvas were not universally loved. Many feared them as much as they respected them. A blessing could turn to curse if received without humility. They were accused of witchcraft, of bending storms, and stirring misfortune for those who disbelieved. Yet the bravest warriors still sought them before battle, begging to know whether victory or death awaited. A true seeress never softened her truth. When she foretold death, she did not whisper. It was spoken plainly, like the sound of steel meeting shield. The rites surrounding Cider were sacred. Before a reading, the Völva fasted for 3 nights and bathed in freezing rivers to cleanse her spirit. She would then light a small fire, burning juniper and birch to summon clarity. Around her, women gathered to sing Galda, sacred songs that lifted her beyond the mortal realm. Their voices rose and fell in rhythm to her breathing until she began to tremble, overtaken by vision. Sometimes she screamed, sometimes she laughed, and sometimes tears streaked her face, though her eyes remained unblinking. When she spoke again, her tone carried both life and eternity. She did not read the future as a map, for fate was a storm that changed shape with every heartbeat. Instead, she saw possibilities, branches that grew from the same trunk, each fork gleaming with consequence. She spoke of choices, not absolutes. The Vikings understood this deeply, for they too lived in a world where light and shadow were in constant struggle. To know one's fate was not to yield to it, but to meet it with courage. The Völva's sight gave them clarity, but never comfort. There are tales of one seeress who predicted the fall of a great chieftain. Heralded as a hero, he invited her to his hall, promising reward for her wisdom. When she warned of his death within 10 nights, he roared with laughter and gave her gold. On the 9th night, during a feast, a spark from the hearth caught the thatch, setting the hall ablaze. None escaped. Those who found the ruins swore that among the ashes, the seeress's staff remained untouched, its carvings glowing faintly beneath the moon. Visions did not always bring ruin. Some foresaw hope, harvests abundant after long winters, sons returned from storm-tossed seas, hearts healed after sorrow. Yet even these words carried edge and burden, for fortune could twist as easily as thread unraveling. The Völva spoke of cycles, teaching that every dawn carried the memory of night and every joy was born from loss. In her wisdom, joy without sorrow was impossible, just as day without darkness defied as law. To live with such knowledge was its own curse. The seeress often bore the toll of her gift in solitude. Her eyes, fixed on what others could not see, made ordinary life unbearable. She walked between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Villagers brought offerings to her door but rarely lingered, unable to endure the silence that surrounded her dwelling. That silence was not emptiness, it was listening, a space between breaths where the unseen murmured. In time, her face became legend, half revered, half remembered. When the great feasts of winter arrived, and mead flowed like golden light, skalds would sing of the Völva who guided kings, who whispered truth into the storm. Her image lived in those verses as both warning and beacon. She represented the courage to face what was inevitable, the understanding that to see the whole tapestry of existence, one must accept that threads of sorrow and hope are woven together. Her sight was not curse or blessing alone. It was both, as all wisdom is. Even centuries later, when the old gods faded from worship and new faiths rose, legends of the seeresses endured. In Nordic folk memory, they became symbols of prophecy, intuition, and the eternal link between human will and the unknowable. Their staffs became metaphors for knowledge, firm, grounded, yet pointing heavenward. Their songs, though lost, echo faintly in poems and dreams, reminders that vision is never truly gone, it merely changes its language. The story of the vulva is not of control, but of surrender, the kind that brings strength rather than weakness. Her lessons still breathe through the ages, that truth often hurts before it heals, that power demands sacrifice, and that even in the darkest night, those who see must learn to forgive what cannot be changed. The Vikings listened to her not as followers, but as witnesses, humbled before the vastness of time itself. For to seek sight was to face oneself stripped bare, reflected in the eyes of destiny. And in that gaze, perhaps, they discovered the strangest comfort of all, that even the gods must bow before what is written in the stars. There were hours in the north when the world seemed to forget sound. Just before the first pale shimmer of dawn touched the horizon, the air turned still, and every living thing paused as if listening to something distant and sacred. The Vikings knew this hour well. They called it the time between breaths, when even the gods were quiet and the threads of fate trembled beneath unseen hands. It was neither night nor day, neither waking nor dream, a fragile doorway where the spirit could wander freely. In that suspended stillness, courage and fear felt the same. Warriors rose early to sharpen their blades, aware that the silence was not peace, but promise. The night watched them depart, its gaze heavy with unspoken warning. Even the ravens, those clever watchers of the battlefield, had not yet stirred from their branches. To move or speak seemed almost sacrilegious, as though disturbing a god's private thought. In this hush before renewal, the line between the living and the lost grew faint. For people who spent their lives on the edge of survival, silence was a force, not an absence. It carried weight, pressing into bone until every sound, footsteps, breath, the creak of wood, felt magnified. In those moments, men and women felt the truth of existence without ornament or distraction. The wind that would later roar across the fjords slept for an instant, turning its power inward. What remained was the hum of the world itself, deep and ancient, vibrating under the frozen earth. The Vikings revered sound, but they revered silence more, for sound was fleeting while silence endured. To them, the pause before dawn was a reminder that all action required stillness to begin. The warrior who charged without reflection met ruin, just as the sailor who ignored calm seas was doomed when storms came. Silence was the teacher before the test, the calm breath before the swing of the axe. Within that pause lay wisdom that could not be shouted, only felt. In their songs and sagas, this hour appeared as a turning point. Heroes dreamed of ancestors whispering counsel before great battles. Children were said to hear voices in the frost, calling names meant to be remembered. When the first beams of light touched the snow, those whispers vanished, leaving behind the mark of purpose. The Vikings believed that if one listened hard enough in the quiet, they might hear the intentions of the Norns themselves, the weavers of fate, deciding which threads would endure another day. Villagers learned to read this stillness as omen. If the hush before dawn felt restless, filled with unseen movement, they feared misfortune would follow. If it was serene and gentle, they took it as blessing. Cattle lay calm, flames burned steady, and dreams brought warmth rather than dread. These subtle signs guided more than farmers. They informed warriors, sailors, even kings. The silence told truths no skald could shape into words. To ignore it was folly. To heed it was wisdom. In houses built close to fjords, the sound of waves usually filled the air. But during those frozen hours, even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Ice cracked softly under moonlight, reminding sailors of paths not yet broken. They stared toward the horizon, their minds measuring distance not in miles, but in memories. Voyages past, friends lost, victories that glimmered like ghostly sails across the dark water. The silence bound them to all who had ever watched dawn approach, waiting for the return of light that never truly belonged to them. It was said that Odin himself valued this hour above all others. Legends spoke of him walking alone through the mists before dawn, neither god nor wanderer, listening for what creation remembered. From this silence he drew prophecy, and from it he shaped counsel for both men and gods. For though his ravens spoke of what was and what would come, only the quiet told him why. The Vikings, in honoring that belief, learned that strength without reflection was empty, and that even gods needed stillness to stand against the storm. In some tales, the silence was personified as a maiden draped in silver frost, named Daggerfrid, the peace of the dawn. She visited those who refused to yield to the night, placing a hand upon their hearts so they might rest before their next struggle. When courage flickered low, she breathed calm into weary souls. But if disturbed or mocked, she could vanish and leave the world in unending dark. Her myth reminded people that quiet was sacred space, to be entered reverently, treated as communion with the divine. Inside longhouses, families awoke during this hour to rekindle fire. The wood caught reluctantly, the flames dim as ghosts before they gathered into life. Smoke rose, carrying with it the scent of pine and truth. Each spark was prayer, humble, wordless, glowing against the vastness beyond. Mothers prepared bread without speaking, fathers checked weapons in silence, and children blinked in awe, sensing they stood at the border between dream and waking. For those brief minutes, everything felt fragile yet whole. As dawn drew closer, shadows thinned but did not retreat entirely. The world glowed blue, caught between disappearance and becoming. To the Vikings, this hue was known as the color of beginnings, the moment when neither moon nor sun ruled. Those who prayed did so now, whispering names of gods and kin to the growing light. The silence wrapped around these murmurs like a cloak, turning their human fragility into something eternal. They believed that each sunrise borrowed strength from the stillness that preceded it. The warriors who prepared for journeys or battles often stood alone outside during this time. They stared at the horizon, where ice met sky, gripping their weapons not out of fear, but reverence. Each understood that breath was finite, yet meaning could outlast flesh. The silence before dawn was the reminder that between heartbeat and death lay choice, the decision to face what awaited with courage rather than resentment. When the first light finally broke, they moved not rushed but renewed, guided by that soundless promise. For others, this time carried grief. The silence reminded widows and parents of absences that never faded. They lit small lamps in remembrance, watching the flames shiver as if touched by unseen hands. But within that sorrow came peace, for the Vikings believed that the departed also walked in that pre-dawn calm, free from pain, close enough to feel but never to see. Between breaths, they were together again. The quiet soothed what words could not. The skalds often began their storytelling at dawn's silence, letting pause precede verse. It was said that no true saga could begin without first listening to the echo of creation itself. Between the hush and the first spoken word, the story found its soul. Thus even art bowed to the rhythm of the hours, the breath before the call, the stillness before song. In this way, silence was not emptiness, but seed, carrying within it every possibility still waiting to be named. On the coldest nights, when the sun had fled for weeks, the stillness before dawn stretched longer, as though time forgot to move. Families lay awake, counting their hopes instead of hours, yearning for the day's return. When finally faint color stirred on the edge of the sky, tears often came unbidden. They were not of sorrow, but recognition, that even after the longest dark light always remembered the way home. It was in those moments that belief became tangible. Life endured, not by might alone, but by the patience found in waiting. The Vikings taught their children that silence was to the soul what frost was to the land. It preserved, clarified, and revealed what lay beneath. Within the stillness, truth ripened. The quiet morning after the chaos of night reminded them that survival demanded not just strength, but listening to the winds, to the sea, to one's own hidden self. They believed this practice connected them to the gods, who too dwelled between storms, learning from the calm that followed battle. When the first golden line finally pierced the horizon and the silence broke with birdsong, relief mixed with gratitude. Yet part of the heart ached for that serenity already fading. The Vikings never feared night because they knew what it offered, moments of deep reflection before life began again. The silence before dawn was the heart of that exchange, the breath the world took before exhaling day. And so they rose, not merely waking but remembering, stepping forward with the quiet strength borrowed from that still and mighty hour. Translate. Every civilization tells stories of monsters, and the Vikings were no different. Yet their beasts were not born solely of imagination. They were carved from the fabric of fear itself, woven from loneliness, hunger, and the endless night that ruled their winters. To the Norse mind, the monstrous was not alien, but intimate, a reflection of what slept within every soul. Their horrors were mirrors polished by darkness, forcing men and women to see their own fragility illuminated against the void. The North was relentless. Mountains, seas, and sky conspired to test mortal endurance, and in that cold crucible, fear became familiar. It took shape in the tales passed down by firelight, monsters that embodied the warnings whispered. Distance blurred between myth and memory until one grew into the other. Those who doubted their existence still spoke their names with caution, not out of belief, but respect. The Vikings knew that to name a monster was to give shape to what otherwise hid in shadow. Among the oldest and most feared was Jörmungandr, the great serpent of the sea. Said to circle the world beneath the waves, it was both boundary and threat. Its restless movement caused storms. Its breath carried venom that poisoned the ocean air. Yet, like all Norse symbols, Jörmungandr was dual in meaning. It was terror, but also balance, the creature that held creation in place by its own encirclement. Should it ever release its tail, they believed the end of all things would begin. The serpent became both nightmare and necessity. Translate. On land, other beings haunted the northern imagination. There was the mare who sat on sleepers' chests, sending dreams that left them gasping for air. Her name gave birth to the word for nightmare, a reminder that even rest was not refuge. In the forests, trolls lurked, ancient stony beings as old as the earth itself. They were not always malevolent. Some were simply indifferent, embodiments of cold reason. To cross their paths without respect was to invite ruin, not for wickedness, but for arrogance. Lightning and thunder, they said, were the gods striking down those who disturbed the old world. Each monster told a story beyond its terror. The Draugr warned against greed, the sea serpent against pride, the mare against self-deception. The Vikings did not create their beasts to escape fear, but to understand it. Through myth, they learned what the human mind often refuses to admit, that darkness cannot be destroyed, only acknowledged and balanced. In that acceptance lay a kind of power, a wisdom older than courage itself. Skalds, the poets of the North, carried these tales like armor. Their verses were charms that shaped memory into guidance. Around the hearth, adults listened with as much reverence as the young, each recounting reawakened primal awe, the knowledge that life was fragile and light temporary. Yet instead of despair, they found comfort in repetition. To tell of monsters was to build a language strong enough to hold what frightened them. Fear became familiar, and familiarity transformed it into understanding. Translate. Some monsters, however, felt hauntingly human. There was the Myling, the ghost of an abandoned child, heard wailing on lonely paths. Travelers said it clung to their backs, growing heavier with each step until the bearer collapsed. The only release came from finding it burial, granting peace through compassion denied in life. These stories spoke of guilt hidden beneath bravery, a reminder that cruelty, not courage, was the true source of haunting. For a people who lived by steel, they knew no weapon cut deeper than regret. The sea itself birthed many terrors. Sailors returning from the edge of the known world spoke of creatures vast enough to block the sun, serpents, leviathans, and kraken that dragged ships into the abyss. Yet beneath their exaggeration lived truth, the unforgiving depth that devoured without malice. The Vikings believed that each wave carried memory, and that storms were the sea remembering old anger. In such a world, monsters were not foreign intrusions, but expressions of things too vast for human language. Even the sky was not free of beasts. The aurora borealis, beautiful ribbons of color, was sometimes seen as the reflections of Valkyrie armor, or to some, as fire from dragons soaring through darkness. Light and terror danced in equal measure across heaven's curtain. This duality fascinated the Norse. The same phenomenon could be omen or blessing, depending on the heart that beheld it. So the northern lights became a lesson disguised as wonder, proof that awe and dread are born from the same light. Translate, the line between human and monster was thin, a reflection the Vikings recognized in themselves. War left its mark not only on flesh, but on spirit. They told of berserkers, warriors who fought with such fury that they seemed possessed, their minds overtaken by something wild and immense. Whether they were blessed by Odin or cursed by beasts was uncertain. What mattered was the reminder they offered, that within all bravery beats a shadow capable of destruction. To master the beast within was to understand the monsters without. Night amplified the imagination, and imagination wove the legends tighter. Every howl became a wolf transformed by old sins. Every strange light across the mountains became souls seeking passage. In truth, fear sharpened their senses, teaching what vigilance meant in a world where death waited close. When dawn finally came, its first light did not erase the monsters. It only tamed them into memory until the next night fell. The cycle was perpetual, as steady as the sea's tide. Children grew up learning the moral behind each beast. They knew that trolls turned to stone not because they were evil, but because they forgot to retreat before daylight arrived, a warning against overconfidence. They learned that even the gods faced their monsters, for at Ragnarok, Odin would fall to the wolf Fenrir, and Thor would drown in Jörmungandr's venom. Their fates were not tragedies, but affirmations that even divinity bends before the natural order. To confront a monster was to honor the balance that shaped both terror and triumph. Translate. Throughout winter feasts, when storytellers grew bold, they blended their fears with song. Music softened horror's edge, and rhythm turned dread into beauty. Some believed that by singing the names of monsters, they lulled them into sleep, ensuring the villagers' peace for one more night. In this way, music became a shield of sound, art transforming fear into reverence. The Vikings did not simply endure fear. They gave it form, voice, and identity, taming it through creation. Perhaps the greatest monster was not the Draugr, nor serpent, nor troll, but forgetting, the act of ignoring fear until it moved unseen. When people ceased to respect what frightened them, disaster followed. The North taught humility, that survival depended on knowing one's place in the great weave. The wind, the sea, the darkness, they were all teachers disguised as threats. To deny them was to walk blindly into their jaws. Yet those who listened learned harmony, finding poems hidden in thunder, lessons in terror. By the flickering fire, when smoke curled between light and dark, the old stories returned once more. The voices lowered, the shadows lengthened, and hearts tightened as monsters walked again in words. But unlike the first tellings, these newer stories ended with calm acceptance rather than panic. The listeners had grown, understanding that the beasts existed not to destroy them, but to shape them. To name the monster was not to curse, but to remember that fear too has its place in the story of life. Translate. As the flames waned and silence reclaimed the hall, what remained was not dread but reverence. The monsters of the Vikings lived not to torment, but to teach. Their existence reminded humanity that courage was meaningless without the honesty of fear. The night outside still whispered, and the wind carried faint echoes of forgotten roars. Yet inside, the fire's glow persisted, proof that stories, like light, could outlast even the longest dark. And so, the monsters slept once more, patiently awaiting the next voice brave enough to call them by name. Translate. In a world where night reigned longer than day, words held more than meaning. They held power. To the Vikings, runes were not symbols of mere communication, but sparks of creation, fragments of the divine language spoken by gods when the world was first carved from chaos. Each mark was alive, humming with its own will, bound by no mortality. When ink or blade formed a rune, something invisible answered, listening and remembering. Through these ancient signs, humanity could speak directly to the forces that shaped light and shadow. In the dark stretches of winter, when voices of the unseen drew near, the people turned to runes for safeguard. They carved them into doorframes, etched them upon weapons, painted them across the decking of ships. Some whispered them as prayers, while others sang them into fires, watching the smoke coil upward like a promise carried to unseen ears. The act itself was a dialogue, a vow that human courage could be etched into the very fabric of night. The origin of runes, as told by the Skalds, was rooted in sacrifice. Odin, lord of wisdom and war, had hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights, wounded by his own spear, to glimpse the secrets hidden beneath existence. From death's threshold, he saw the runes shimmer in the void and seized them, gifting their power to mankind. Thus, every rune was born from pain and revelation, carrying within it the memory of divine endurance. To carve one was not simply to write, it was to participate in that primal act of insight and cost. Translate. At the heart of the longhouse, where family and fate intertwined, the hearth burned as the soul's center. Its light never truly went out. Embers were nursed through the night by careful hands. To let a hearth die was considered misfortune, as though warmth itself had turned its face away. Those embers were used to light new homes, weddings, and voyages, threads of fire passed from one generation to the next. Through this ritual, families believed their ancestors' blessings lived on, woven into every flame that kept darkness at bay. The holy ceremonies involving iron carried equal weight. Blacksmiths were revered as half-craft, half-priest. In shaping metal, they whispered runes to steady the work, striking carefully so the hammer's rhythm matched the heartbeat of the forge. Some said each spark contained a prayer. Others believed it was a fragment of divine fire stolen from the gods. The smith's art lay not just in creation, but in awakening, the transformation of lifeless ore into something that remembered its maker. To wield a blade forged without reverence was courting ruin, for such weapons turned upon their masters. Iron guarded homes as well as warriors. Nails shaped with care were driven into doorframes to seal out wandering spirits. Amulets of miniature hammers were carried as charms against misfortune. Mothers placed small blades under cradles to ward off the draugr or other restless dead. These traditions were not superstition, but dialogue, a conversation between mortality and mystery. To live in the North meant negotiating constantly with forces beyond comprehension, and iron was humanity's promise to endure them. Translate. Every oath tied to these symbols came at a cost. Promises made in fire were final. To betray them was not merely dishonor, but desecration. In some sagas, oath-breakers were condemned to wander spiritless, unable to light a fire or forge iron again. They were exiled to the cold beyond memory, where neither gods nor ancestors acknowledged them. Such tales were not threats, they were instruction. In a world where words shaped destiny, truth could not survive without the discipline of promise. Silence was safer than false swearing. Some oaths were made not in triumph, but in grief. When loved ones were lost to sea or war, Families lit pyres that mirrored the sun's last glow before nightfall. As smoke curled into the sky, it carried the final words of farewell. The pyre blaze was both tomb and transcendence, kissing the dead goodbye while connecting the living to eternity. The Vikings believed that within the fire's heart, the soul grew light enough to cross the bridge to Valhalla. In burning, they found peace. In ash, they found renewal. The sea, too, became home to iron vows. Sailors cast nails or rings into the waves before departing, asking the gods to temper the ocean's wrath. Fire could not burn upon water, but iron could sink where prayers could not reach. The ritual was simple yet profound, a gift of what was man-made to what was eternal. In return for safe passage, they promised honor and humility upon return. These exchanges formed the unseen treaty that bound mankind to the dangerous generosity of Translate, the duality of fire and iron reflected the human condition itself. Both capable of creation and destruction, they mirrored the paradox of courage, strength born from fragility. Fire could illuminate or consume, iron could protect or wound. The Vikings learned that mastering these forces meant mastering themselves. Their balance was sacred, for to lose one was to lose all control over fate. Thus, the warrior who sharpened his blade by lamplight and the mother who guarded her children by hearth shared the same faith: order through reverence, survival through respect. Not all understood these laws. There were those who mocked oaths, who treated the sacred lightly. One saga told of a chieftain who swore by the fire in jest, promising generosity and deliverance while hiding deceit. When winter came, his stores burned in a storm of unnatural flame. The villagers whispered that his own oath had returned to devour him. Whether accident or judgment, the lesson persisted. The fire knows truth even when men forget. To speak falsely before flame was to wound the balance between spirit and trust. There was beauty, too, in these ancient rites. At solstices, entire communities gathered around towering bonfires, celebrating not only light's endurance, but the shared breath of existence. Iron instruments rang like bells, echoing across fjords, while voices rose in prayer and laughter. They sang of the sun's return, of ancestors who walked beside the flames unseen. For one night, fear dissolved into communion, and the cold that ruled the north bowed briefly to human warmth. The fire reflected on every face, uniting them under its glow as equals, mortals, fragile yet eternal in spirit. Translate. Children grew up knowing that fire demanded stewardship, not dominance. They learned to read its moods, the fast-burning hunger of dry wood, the gentle hiss of snowflake on ember. Iron taught patience. Each strike on the anvil was a heartbeat of time. The lessons of their elders were simple yet profound. Listen before acting. Balance strength with humility. Keep your word as the flame keeps its light. These were not ruled by law, but by ritual. Passed through gestures repeated so often they became second. The ritual of respect was what protected them from disappearance. As generations turned, these practices endured even as the world changed. Christianity would later bring new symbols, new prayers, but beneath their surface, the old reverence burned quietly on. The hearth remained sacred, the sword still carried whispering strength, and oaths still sealed the fabric of society. What changed was not the essence, but the language. Fire and iron continued to shape destiny, teaching that faith, whatever its form, was not about gods afar, but courage found within, glowing steady like a coal that refused to die. To this day, when a candle burns low or a blade gleams beneath moonlight, something ancient stirs, a faint remembrance of voices who saw the divine in every spark and shard. The Viking world may have sunk beneath time, but its lessons smolder on. That honor is a fire to be tended, that strength is the iron we forge in adversity, and that every oath, whether whispered or shouted, binds more than words. It binds soul to meaning. In the dance of flame and the ring of steel, mankind still finds its reflection, eternal and fleeting all at once.